Thank you, Will. So one strength of our network is that it's a worldwide, and we take different geographical perspective to the same big phenomenon. So now we are moving close to the Arctic and even beyond. So holistic effects of climate change on the culture, well-being and health of the Saami. I would like to acknowledge my two co-authors, both social anthropologist Suvi Juntunen and Klementti Näkkäläjärvi. Klementti Näkkäläjärvi is himself a Saami, and he was a president of the Saami parliament for several years before joining us and coming back to academia after some frustration in the legislation of indigenous people in Finland. So here is, as I said, another perspective to the globe. Around 40 indigenous people inhabit the Arctic region, forming about 10% of the total population in that area. The Saami live in the northern parts of Finland, Sweden and Norway, and in Kola Peninsula of the Russian Federation, circled in red in this map. So the indigenous people in the Arctic are possibly the most vulnerable populations to the effects of climate change from two fundamental reasons. First of all, in their traditional way of life, they live in a very close but harmonic interaction with the natural environment. Second, the climate change has the strongest effects in the northern hemisphere because the change in temperature is much greater towards the north. So we could perhaps ask also whether they would serve as the first indicators of the effects of harmful environmental conditions and change. And I'm talking about really holistic, very fundamental effects. So, being the only indigenous people of the European Union, the Saami population consists of about 100,000 people, in Finland about 11,000. Many of them still pursue traditional livelihoods, reindeer husbandry, fishing, handicrafts, hunting and gathering. And the Saami were moving nomads until the 1950s, when the borders between the Nordic countries were closed and stopped this type of natural movement of their way of life. The languages are listed as endangered in the UNESCO classification. The photograph here is probably late 40s, early 50s, grandparents of Klementti during the time when they were moving with the reindeers. So the overall objective of the work we are doing was to try to elaborate the holistic effects of climate change on the Saami, with specifically to develop a framework for understanding the holistic effects of climate change and on the Saami, but we think more generally on the indigenous people in the north. And to summarize, what from the scientific knowledge can be known about the primary, secondary and tertiary effects of climate change. So the picture on the left shows a framework for our studies with the idea of various causal paths related to global change. And originally, in my center, we have been focusing on public health, but in this project, we expanded the area to cover culture, well-being, and health. And of course, this is a really multidisciplinary approach using different disciplines and different methods. The picture on the right side tries to illustrate the different levels on which climate change has direct or indirect influences. Also, the societal influences as well as competing land use play a role. So all of these things interact and influence each other. And yesterday in the plenary we heard an indigenous view to the type of land use and environmental issues some of the indigenous people meet every day. So we approached this issue in a systematic manner. So we wanted to use all the existing scientific evidence on the topic, using an iterative process for identifying the main keywords, because of course this is an opening. There was no strict a priori list of keywords. Starting from about 1900 papers, we ended up in about 300 papers that were reviewed more carefully. This table shows what type of areas were covered with respect to health of the Saami, divided into the 4 different countries and different topics. First of all, so we are talking about a puzzle trying to fill in pieces in the big framework. There were no singular study addressing the overall issue of climate change and Saami culture and health and well-being, but it were different fractions on health phenomena, natural changes, possible influences of the things related to global change. I will get into those. So, of the primary effects of climate change, and now we're talking about culture, well-being and health. So much of the work focused on ongoing and past changes in the vegetation and climate and the climate scenarios. And what is critical here is really the changes in snow. Snow cover is critical for reindeer husbandry, and it's illustrated with the fact that the Saami language has 400 words characterizing snow. You can just think in your mind how perhaps Canadians have about 50. So anyway, so change in snow conditions have a negative effect on reindeer pasture conditions, the way it changes. Also, changes in the carrying capacity of ice, snow quality and formation are likely to increase, for example, the risk of transport-related accidents, as well as influence reindeers. Primary health effects of climate change are likely to increase among Saami reindeer herders. We can infer from the effects of heat waves, without a singular study focusing on the indigenous people, that there are potential effects as in larger population. Also, occupational accidents, there is incidental evidence of the increase related to the environmental conditions linked to warming of the climate. On secondary effects, so there is the idea that Northern Atlantic Oscillation continues to produce milder and milder winter weather that will influence the pasture conditions. Warm summers will promote the development of animal parasite outbreaks. There is some evidence of the increase in trends. Arctic snow cover is a storage for contaminants and heavy metal pollution, and reduced snow cover increases precipitation. Increased precipitation can expose humans to these pollutants. There are also evidence of the effects of melting of permafrost in Siberia, releasing various microbial agents. So from the limited literature, there is indication of impacts on livelihood culture, as well as to the future expectations of the people. Finally, the tertiary effects of climate change on the environment and livelihood are likely to influence the future expectations, which may induce mental health problems. There are several reports from different countries on the increased stress, anxiety, worrying, and depression. There is also qualitative data based on interviews on concerns of the herders. And at the same time, there is incidental evidence of increased suicide risk and even some suicide epidemics. And then additionally, also the mitigation processes will influence the everyday life and increase the stress, such as hydro and wind power development has impacts also on the culture and reindeer herding. So with the limited evidence, we tried to build framework for different causal pathways. Definitely, the evidence is fractional, but if we look at the various effects illustrated, I probably don't have. Okay, so I don't have much time to go into details, but there will be changes in the ecological base of the Saami, and the ecosystem changes will have various types of increase in health risks, and the cultural effects through the pressure of changes in the way of life, future expectations, and changes will influence also the culture. There is increasing immigration away from this area, which will also impact the development. So, in conclusion, so it seems that cultural well-being in the Saami context will depend on social community and kinship structures that are influenced environmental relationship and traditional livelihoods, and ultimately the possibility of maintaining the Saami identity and the language, as discussed in yesterday's plenary in a very well. And loss of language, culture, and living in urban areas will expose Saami to lifestyle changes that are likely to have negative implications, both for mental and physical health. Of course, there are possibilities for positive influences as well. It depends on the type of choices and possibilities of adaptation. And crucial challenges are the small population size, which is decreasing, dispersed settlements and urbanization that also will limit the possibilities of cultural adaptation in the changing climate.